Even though it feels like I was just recording a video about the first season, the second half of the Total Drama reboot from last year has already wrapped up. And given that I really enjoyed that first batch of episodes, and you guys seem to like listening to me talk about them, it's time to go through the second season with the show's fourth generation of campers. Obviously, massive spoilers for the entire season in this video, so if you haven't seen it and you have any desire to, please do not watch any further. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into things, starting with the most fun topic of this video.
Here on Total Drama Island.
What better way to start a video about a genuinely great season of television than talking about the absolutely inexcusably horrendous way they've gone about releasing it? While the show's Canadian roots somewhat hides this fact, Total Drama is not some tiny little niche show, and the fact that both seasons of the reboot have been released months ahead of anywhere else in either Italy or in the UK is just such a disaster. Remember the first season of the show that I covered back in April? Well, it's now January and it's still radio silence regarding when those episodes are going to be available to law-abiding Americans. Even Canadians, where the show is made, had to wait several months for the first season and will presumably have to do the same for this one. Total Drama is the type of show that feeds off of everybody watching the episodes together as they come out, something that the series figured out as soon as season 1, and something that the executives behind distribution seemingly never will. Not to be a bummer, but there is a very real chance that, at least for the next several years, the reason that we don't get any more Total Drama has nothing to do with reception or fan support, but instead everything to do with the fact that everybody will have moved on by the time it comes out. Still, while I get that the majority of people won't, if the show ever does come out where you live, please just let it run in the background or something so that these companies will at least have a fraction of an idea of how much support this show genuinely has. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the actually fun stuff to talk about in this video, starting with the premise of the season, which is essentially just that everybody is back on the island for a second go-around. On the one hand, not having to establish any new characters or any new locations allows for so much more time for exploring character dynamics that, as I'll go through throughout the bulk of this video, creates one of the most fun casts that any season has ever had. On the other hand, the actual physical island plays almost no role in this season besides just being the ground that the shenanigans take place on. And while that is perfectly fine, in comparison to something like Action or World Tour, it does create some pretty bland set pieces. Again, I completely support the choice to keep everything to a minimum in order to focus on the characters, but also, if we do somehow get another season with these guys, it's really gotta have something to spice things up. Whether that be a completely new location or just a few new campers, this cast on this island has definitely hit its limit. Anyway, moving on. Just like the last season, let's go through the 6 C's that make a Total Drama season great.
Salesman said these are more romantic.
I really thought you couldn't make this any weirder. Then you did.
Alright, as you may have noticed, there's a brand new C added to the 5 from before. But before we get to that, let's talk about the host of the season, Chris and Chef. In general, these two just simply have a smaller role in the season when compared to the previous one. In fact, there's only really one dynamic between Chris and a camper, but we'll get to that when we talk about that character. Throughout the season, the main purpose of these two guys seems to just be doing jokes while the rest of the action is going on. And while everything in this segment has sounded pretty negative so far, I actually don't really hate the direction that they take with these two in this one. Sure, I do miss the camaraderie between Chris and the campers on the original island, but the gags that they do with these two guys throughout the 13 episodes range from pretty funny to actually hilarious. And they once again continue the bromance romance between them. While they aren't a huge part of the season, I still think they use them well, even if we'll never get another mention of Chef's time in the military ever again. Anyway, time to get to the brand new C, which is the cameos this time around. Clearly, the people behind this season understood that this might be it for a while, and thus we get the return of 4, kind of 5 characters from the past seasons of the franchise, as well as getting to see even more characters referenced in the pinball challenge. And while getting to see some of the series' most famous old people was cool, and I'll talk a little bit more about MacArthur and her dogs later, the obvious highlight cameo-wise is Owen. And while his voice is a little bit off, and his age doesn't really make any sense, it sure was nice to see the gluttonous guy again. More so than anybody besides Chris, Owen has always felt like the face of the franchise, and getting to see him in the flesh for a pretty solid chunk of an episode was really enjoyable. Anyway, next up on the list of C's are the campers, which I'm going to kinda skip past for now since it's the same guys as before, and I'm about to go through them one by one, but just in general, this season has continued to prove that this set of campers is easily the best we've had since World Tour, and it's probably closer than you think. Anyway, out of these 6 C's, you could argue that the most important is the comedy, and man, this season has a ton of it. Seriously, while there are still a few jokes that try to be modern references and end up kinda falling flat, this season is the most consistently funny outing this franchise has put out since probably World Tour. Pretty much every single character made me laugh at one point or another, and even more so than the season prior, it felt like there was a gag that I found genuinely hilarious pretty dang frequently. Obviously, I'm going to talk about the comedy of this season much more as I go through the characters, but in general, this season's blend of some of the best physical comedy they've ever done, mixed in with some of the most offbeat verbal gags I can remember in this franchise, creates a season that, even as somebody who is objectively older than the show's demographic, I found myself having to pause frequently so I didn't miss anything while I was laughing. And finally, let's talk about the challenges for this season, which are definitely a mixed bag. Some of them are genuinely great, like the ice challenge, the attack dogs, especially with the hilarity of Chris and MacArthur, or the one about facing your fears, but the rest of them more or less just feel like avenues for character development. And while this does create the really fun cast that I'm going to spend the rest of this video praising, I do miss the completely wacky antics that the show used to consistently bring out. Anyway, that's about it for things that I can talk about without naming a single camper. So let's go ahead and get into the most fun part of the season to discuss, starting with the pre-merge eliminations.
And I didn't play great today. I should have read the training binder. Yeah.
Alright, so the title of this section is definitely a bit harsh, especially for the last character I'll talk about, but it's definitely not a stretch to say that, in comparison to the other 11, these 5 characters just don't have the same impact on the season. Getting into the first one, as I predicted in my video about the first half, out of all of the early season boots from last time, Scary Girl always made the most sense to go home early again. And while there probably was a way to morph her character into somebody who could have lasted long term, it always made the most sense for the characters to just vote her off at the first opportunity. Still, I feel like they do a pretty good job with her character despite this. For starters, at least in her episode 1 appearance, she's the only character to have visually changed in between seasons, having tried to become a normal girl with the creepiness only being amplified by her new appearance. This leads to multiple great jokes throughout her 22 minutes of competing, giving her a more memorable presence in the season than most of the other characters in this section. Also, while other characters being represented in challenges after their elimination is a constant throughout the season, season, no other character is mentioned as much as Lauren, and I think that was the best way to utilize her without somehow floating her further in the game. Moving on, let's go ahead and group together Chase and Emma, as despite spending most of their time somewhat apart in this season, they pretty much have the same story. Both of these characters have had pretty big roles in the first season, so it's not exactly devastating to see them both out so early this time around. But still, I kinda just wish they had more going on. Chase continues to fight for the crown of being the dumbest character in this cast, as he proves too useless to not send home, and Emma goes home after losing a challenge for her team without any other real semblance of a plotline. Emma's elimination especially does sting a little bit, as her friendship with Bowie that was so great in the last season is just nowhere to be seen, as he gets wrapped up in Hockey Bro shenanigans. We'll get to them later in this video, but first, let's continue talking about the pre-merge boots with Millie. Given what this season will eventually do with Priya, it makes sense that they were going to have to get rid of Millie pretty quick, and they do it by just highlighting that she's still the incapable jerk that she was in the first season, just without Priya forcing her to be better. I'm glad they don't actually go through with what seemed to be a repeat of her season 1 arc with the whole manual from Priya and all, and honestly, I think I just got enough Millie from the first season. She probably should have just gone home immediately after what she did to Damien, but the little bit of her trying to apologize to him was a nice, somewhat positive send-off to her character. And finally, before getting to the characters with a more solid presence in the show, let's talk about the one pre-merge boot who actually has an argument to go further, being Nichelle. On the one hand, her elimination serves to further another character's season, who I'm going to be talking about at length towards the end of the video. On the other hand, Nichelle just doesn't really get to do anything in this season after showing signs of life at the start. During the first go-around, Nichelle's whole character revolved around her being an action star who can't actually do anything, and now that she suddenly can, it just doesn't really leave her much of a character to develop upon after the first episode or two. Sure, I really like her stuff with Damien, especially in her last episode, but unless they were going to introduce another wrinkle into her character, I think they got the most out of what her character could provide in the 5 episodes she competed in. And her elimination is a great moment, just for a different character. Well, those are the 5 campers who never make it off their teams, so let's move on to the 11 who did, starting with the Miscellaneous 4.
Ripper, hands up!
Anything for you, my doomsday prepping Picasso?
Starting with the only pair of this group, the relationship between Ripper and Axel is probably the hottest take I have in this video, but I just can't help but absolutely love it. Every part of this pairing, from Ripper trying to flirt for the first chunk of the season, to Axel hilariously accepting his poem, to them just making out in the background until they're sent home, is just so funny to me. Does it kind of stink that both of their characters pretty much only exist in this season relative to each other? Yeah, kinda. But is it funny enough to forgive? Easily. Ripper just quitting when Axel leaves is a nice way to weave in this season's inherently necessary double elimination, and I do like that they don't unnecessarily break them up at the end of the season. While these two characters don't exactly provide much substance outside of comedy, they really don't need to, as whenever they're together, or even in the brief moments that they aren't, they make up some of the funniest parts of the season. Moving on. Damien is perhaps the character that is hardest to talk about in this season, as it's a little bit difficult to try and understand what they were even trying to do with his character this time around. I know that sounds dumb given the fact that he's in so many episodes, but genuinely, I just can't ever grasp what direction they were trying to go with his character. Even back in the first season, his gimmick was already one of the least firm of the cast, as he was just vaguely a nerd who just also happened to have never seen Total Drama. However, both of these things are gone this season, so he just ends up kind of being dim-witted and incompetent, with his only interactions with other characters being him setting them up to talk about their character development. point. The one big role that he has in this season is him getting the immunity idol and then him getting it stolen, which is this immensely well done moment in the show, but just for the person who steals his immunity idol and not him. Throughout this entire season, most of the Damien moments are either him accidentally doing well despite his incompetence, or him rotating around a more important character. Moving on, we've got Z, who in this season mostly exists relative to its main couple that we'll unfortunately get to a bit later. But before then, he does get some good jokes, mostly revolving around him having a soda sponsorship this time around, and he's just generally good for a solid gag in between other scenes. But mostly, he exists to add tension to Caleb and Priya, and as soon as that tension is released, so is he. In this sense, Z is just kind of a casualty to the most hated plot of the season, as he really just has no other reason to stick around after that point. Still, while he is on the island, he's got some great jokes, and what more can you really expect from him in a season 2? Anyway, I originally had this video scripted to segue nicely into Priya and Caleb after this point, but I think we need some positivity given its title, so let's skip around a bit and talk about Wayne, Raj, and a little bit of Bowie.
Don't know what to say, don't know what to do. I was not prepared for losing you.
Since Emma is busy doing nothing and getting eliminated, Bowie just more or less sticks around the Hockey Bros, as their story for the season goes from how do the three of them interact, to how do Raj and Wayne do without Bowie, and finally, how does Wayne do without either of them. For the first chunk of that, it mostly revolves around Bowie balancing his desire to win, even if it means cheating, with his desire to be honest with Raj, who is very against unsportsmanlike activity. Also, just a side note, the format of this video doesn't allow me to fit this point in super well, but Team Skunkbutt is easily in my top 3 teams this show has ever had. Seriously, almost all of my favorite parts of the season are on this team, and the dynamic between the final 6 members of the squad is more than great. Anyway, back to Bowie. While eliminating him early-ish was likely the right play for the season, I do love that they include a bit of him jockeying for leadership with Julia, and that he just completely gets outplayed by her towards the end. Seeing him still get to do some strategizing is a nice way to say goodbye to his character, and while I'm saving most of the finale talk for the end of the video, he's pretty great there too. It is kind of a shame how little Raj and Bowie moments there are in this season though, as their romance is just kept to a few lines and a few shots, which, while I get that they did have a pretty big role in the last season, I was still just a bit surprised on how little the two of them interact without Wayne. Speaking of which, after Bowie goes home, we get to the Wayne and Raj comic relief part of their story, and as you can hopefully predict, I loved every second of it. From tormenting Julia, to bombing every challenge, to getting hit with most of this season's physical comedy, these two guys are just consistently so wholesomely funny. Even during Raj's elimination, which only happens because the pair can't help but follow some coin flip ritual, the sweetness of Raj saying goodbye is matched up with one of my favorite jokes of the season, as Wayne just stands around not knowing what to do without Raj. The next 4 characters I'm going to talk about in this video aren't really deep comedy wells, so a good chunk of the season relies on the Hockey Bros to be funny, and they just consistently knock it out of the park. And finally, after Raj is voted off, it's just Wayne left. And while I am saving talk of the finale until the end of the video, I will just say that, besides what's probably the funniest gag in the season of Wayne listening to sad music after Raj's departure, Wayne trying to navigate the hatred of Julia, Caleb, and Priya leads to immensely fun moments consistently, as he pretty easily and very quickly became one of my favorite characters that this franchise has ever put out. Anyway, we'll get back to him and his luck in the finale later, but first, since I do want to save my favorite part of the season for last, I guess we do finally have to talk about the least beloved part of the season, and what I assume the majority of the comments on this video are going to be about, Priya and Caleb.
You and me till the end, big guy.
Excuse me?
So, let's talk about the Priya and Caleb situation. To start with the positives, I really don't hate the idea of this plot in general. While I'm sure a good chunk of fans believe that Priya should have just gone home early since she won the first season, the writers weren't going to take a character they liked enough to make a winner and not do anything with her the second time around. Similarly, Caleb was obviously the most likely character who got eliminated early last time to make it further in this season, and combining them together makes sense. In fact, I think there's a version of this plot, especially if they turned them a bit more morally ambiguous, that fans would have really liked, as I think that a Justin-type turnaround would make sense for Caleb's character, and that Priya would obviously be targeted as a previous winner and might have to rely on some shadier tactics. But instead, we get an entire season's worth of these two having the main plot of the competition in the majority of the episodes. A plot that was pretty easy to spot as soon as Caleb explained that he wasn't initially interested when talking to Z. And yeah, I get it. Total Drama has been doing predictable romances since Gwen and Trent, but in comparison to the infinitely more entertaining Bowie and Raj, or even Ripper and Axel, this relationship just never really does anything entertaining. And of course, the worst part is obviously how much time it takes up, as not only does it require that these two make up half of the final four, but it also means that characters like Raj, Damien, and MK all go out in episodes that feel like they don't even have the time to send them off, in between Caleb fumbling everything over and over and over again. The plot only gets dumber right at the end too, as Caleb deciding that he needs to be honest with Julia feels a bit much for a guy who got into this mess by trying to trick Priya in the first place. In general, this plot isn't inherently bad, and I would really just call it mediocre in comparison to the rest of the franchise, but as far as the rest of this season goes, it's probably both the least entertaining and the most prevalent plotline here, which has obviously led to less than positive fan reception. At least Priya's elimination is done really well, but that doesn't really fit in this section. So while we'll catch up with Caleb in the finale at the end of this video, let's finally get to the biggest contributor to this video's title, the villains of the season.
If MK's brain drove a cool car, I'd date it.
Hey there!
If you told me that Julia would end up being the primary antagonist of this season back after the first part aired, I would have been somewhat disappointed by the pretty lame decision that was sure to create a lackluster antagonist season. Instead, as it's probably impossible to deny, Julia put together one of the greatest and most enjoyable seasons by any character in the entire franchise, and MK was a perfect running mate throughout that process. We'll get back to them as a pairing in a bit, but to just talk about Julia for a second, one of the biggest things that creates a good antagonist season, as seen through Heather and Alejandro, is having a large impact on the game as a whole. And in almost every single elimination ceremony, Julia has at least somewhat of an influence, or is just completely responsible for who goes home. My favorite Julia takedowns of the season, of which there are many, include her getting Nichelle off the island by taking advantage of her desire to get back in the industry, her complete mental domination of Bowie, and the wonderful two-part removal of Damien and Priya after she stole the idol. I think my favorite part of those last two is how the show chooses to not explicitly show her taking the idol, but instead rely on the audience's knowledge of the character to figure out that if anybody was going to take take it, it was always going to be her. In almost every episode of this season, Julia pulls off gradually more complicated schemes that culminate in her generally having one of the most dominant 12 episodes that the show has ever seen, all while also just being immensely fun to watch, both in how ridiculous some of these plans are, or in how she interacts with the hockey bros once she gets rid of Bowie. Of course, Julia doesn't go about this alone, as she's partnered up with MK until the latter's elimination. And while the pair never gets as explicitly romantic as most fans would want, it's just a ton of fun. Combining MK's schemes from the first season with Julia's sense of pure evil creates so many fun scenarios for the show to play around with, including the fact that, as I mentioned when talking about Bowie, through MK's really clever intern disguise, they cheat through most of the team challenges. This also creates a really fun dynamic between Chris and MK that feels a bit like a better version of Chris and Duncan from All Stars, which leads to some of the best moments that Chris has in this season. But more so than anything else, it's the chemistry between this pair that consistently made for some of my favorite moments in each episode, as every jab they take at other characters, or confessional they give together, or moment of strange friendship as they talk about backstabbing each other, just makes for immensely enjoyable scenes over and over and over again. Even MK's elimination, although a bit earlier than I would have wanted, is done really well, as Julia executes her least cruel plan to take out the camper that she hates the least, all while feeling bad while doing it. These two also have a great finale once Julia makes it on a fantastic final move to eliminate Priya and somehow make Caleb think it's his fault, which I think we're finally able to get to. Without any further ado, let's talk about the episode that this has all been leading to, the finale of it all. Season finales have a complicated history in total drama, and by complicated, I mean mostly bad. Good seasons like Action have bad finales, bad seasons like Pakatu have bad finales, and even when the show manages to pull together a mostly good final episode, like an Island or World Tour, they manage to slightly ruin it with some last-second BS, either because they have to try and allow themselves to make an alternate ending, or because they have too much of a desire to punish a villain beyond what they deserve. So, with all of that being said, where does that leave this season's finale, sore losers? Well, go ahead and get your comments ready to go, because I personally find this to be one of the best episodes that the franchise has ever put out. As besides the challenge, which is pretty much the same final challenge they've done for a few seasons in a row, it's nearly perfect. Let's start with the biggest positive that this episode has going for it, which is that instead of just the normal couple of helpers, this finale brings back the entire cast. This not only creates immediate comedy, like Julia only having MK, or everybody else either rooting against Julia or for Wayne, but it also allows for a good final look at nearly every single character. It gives us more MK and Julia, it gives us more Scary Girl than arguably her only episode competing did, it gives us some final Bowie Raj Wayne shenanigans, it just does so much for campers that we'll perhaps never see again that it's impossible to hate. Having all of these guys back also creates what's my pick for the funniest episode of the entire reboot. With stuff like Team Caleb not being able to root against Wayne, or MK shooting Z for no reason, or just everything with Team Wayne having to force him to compete is so funny, as it feels like the show never really lets up. Also, the seasonal punishment of the villain is pretty tame this time around, as giving Julia a mullet is more funny than cruel, and doesn't even impede her ability in this challenge. But of course, to be honest with each other, the discussion around this episode was never going to focus on the first 20 minutes or how entertaining they were, but instead was always going to be on who won. And since we've been given no indication that there are going to be alternate ultimate winners, I'm going to treat it as if what we got is all we'll ever get. And yes, from a purely strategic angle, obviously Julia had the most impressive season and therefore deserved to win. And yes, from a storytelling angle, as well as the logistics of the final challenge being purely physical, Caleb is the most capable and the most prevalent character of the season, and therefore he deserved to win. But also, I would be completely lying if I told you that, as the three of them were hurtling towards the finish line, that I wasn't hoping that Wayne would be the one to pull through. After watching Julia do enjoyable to watch, yet pretty cruel stuff to characters that I liked, and after watching Caleb hijack the season with Priya shenanigans, I was completely ready for Wayne to win via complete happenstance. And while I can be fully cognizant of the idea that the other two outcomes might have been more objectively fitting, I don't think there's anything that I would have enjoyed more than watching his crew celebrate with Wayne as he became a millionaire. And ultimately, my enjoyment is the only thing I can judge the season for. Before wrapping things up, let's quickly go through what I think is ultimately next for Total Drama. I think it's exceedingly safe to say that the next batch of episodes have not been greenlit, and likely won't until, at the very earliest, the second season airs in Canada. And in that absolutely best case scenario, where the studio somehow understands how poorly they fumbled the release and orders a new season later this year, we're likely looking at 2026 at the very earliest. So everything that I'm about to talk about won't be something that we get anytime soon. Looking at what could come next, there are really 4 options, and in my opinion, from least to most likely, we've got another spin-off season like Redonkulous Race, an all-star season, a 3rd season with this cast and maybe a few new characters, or the most likely option, a completely new set of campers. I think the one that I would be the most excited for is the 3rd option, especially if we got Alejandro and Sierra type of additions to this already great cast. But no matter what it is, whenever we do get more Total Drama content, I'll be ready to give it a try, and I just hope that it can be at least somewhat as good as these past 2 seasons. In general, in this reboot-centric era of cartoons, I think we can officially call the Total Drama reboot a massive success, despite the studios actively trying to bury it. The 2nd season especially was really good, and while I don't want to do any rankings of the seasons on the basis that I haven't seen some of them in quite some time, it's hard to imagine this batch of episodes not sliding into the top 3 after how much I just genuinely enjoyed watching it. Even despite the completely wacky way that the show has aired, the fandom around the show has come alive in ways that I never would have expected, and especially during the small period of time where the show was actually airing weekly, it was so much fun to see everybody's theories and everybody's predictions and everybody's genuine fear of Caleb winning. And while I'll of course miss watching all of these characters and their shenanigans, I think I'll miss the general vibe of Total Drama airing even more. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to anybody who watched this video, as the general format of this channel doesn't allow me to talk about Total Drama as much as I would want to, so I relish any opportunity I can get. In general, it's somewhat difficult to commit to these longer videos on shows besides the 2 that I usually talk about on this channel, so if you want to see me talk about other seasons of the show in this format, such as Redonkulous Race, please let me know in the comments, and if enough people mention it, I'll promise I'll do another video before the next Total Drama reboot. If you want to yell at me for this video not just being 30 minutes of trashing Ripper, you can find my Twitter somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week for more regularly scheduled episode breakdowns. Thanks for watching.